world leaders at the Group of Seven Economic Summit in Canada. Allies that are upset over new tariffs he's imposed on steel and aluminum imports. Joining us now, one of the architects of that controversial plan, White House trade advisor Peter Navarro. Mr. Navarro, the summit ended with a nasty dust-up between President Trump and Canadian Prime Minister Trudeau. He held a news conference after the summit in which he said Canada will retaliate for tariffs that the U.S. has imposed on Canadian aluminum and steel. Here is Trudeau.
We move forward with retaliatory measures on July 1st, applying equivalent tariffs to the ones that the Americans have unjustly applied to us. Canadians were polite, we're reasonable, but we also will not be pushed around.
Well, President Trump responded with this tweet while flying here on Air Force One to Singapore. Trudeau of Canada acted as so meek and mild during our G7 meetings, only to give a news conference after I left. Very dishonest and weak. Question, Mr. Navarro, is that really how we want to deal with our second biggest trading partner?
Chris, there's a special place in hell for any foreign leader that engages in bad faith diplomacy with President Donald J. Trump and then tries to stab him in the back on the way out the door. And that's what bad faith Justin Trudeau did with that stunt press conference. That's what weak, dishonest Justin Trudeau did, and that comes right from Air Force One. And I'll tell you this, to my friends in Canada, that was one of the worst political miscalculations of a Canadian leader in modern Canadian history. All Justin Trudeau had to do was take the win. President Trump did the courtesy to Justin Trudeau to travel up to Quebec for that summit. He had other things, bigger things on his plate in Singapore, where you are now, Chris. He did him a favor, and he was even willing to sign that socialist communique. And what did Trudeau do as soon as the plane took off from Canadian airspace? Trudeau stuck our president in the back. That will not stand. And as far as this retaliation goes, the American press needs to do a much better job of what the Canadians are getting ready to do, because it's nothing short of an attack on our political system, and it's nothing short of Canada trying to raise its high protectionist barriers even higher on things like maple syrup and other goods.
Mr. Navarro, I got a lot to talk to you about, but I do have to press this. You used some very strong words. Stab in the back, special place in hell. You said that came from Air Force One. Are those the views? Are those the words of the president?
Those are my words, but they're the sentiment that was on Air Force One after that. Look, Chris, this was just wrong what Trudeau was doing. The Canadians are totally bungling our trade relationships, and it's due to their leadership. Take NAFTA, for example. We'd have a deal. We'd have a great deal with NAFTA by now if the Canadians would spend more time at the bargaining table and less time lobbying Capitol Hill and our press and state governments here. They are just simply not playing fair, dishonest, weak.
Well, I want to pick up on this, though, Mr. Navarro, because it isn't just Canada. Germany's Chancellor, Angela Merkel, released a photo of the summit, and there was no comment on it, but it certainly looked like it was President Trump against the other members of the G6, America's closest allies. And I want to pick up on this point, because the last time you were on with me on Fox News Sunday, you said that no country would retaliate for the tariffs that we're going to impose. But let's take a look at, in fact, what has happened since we last talked. Canada has announced tariffs on $13 billion in U.S. goods. The European Union will impose tariffs on $3 billion in American products. I understand, sir, that the objective of the president's trade policy, with your advice, some would call it a trade war, is to get the other countries to lower their tariffs on us, but hasn't the practical effect been to get them to raise their tariffs on our products?
So one of my favorite quotes of this president happened just yesterday when he said, "We've been the piggy bank for the world, and that's got to stop." If you look at Angela Merkel's Europe, you see a continent where we run a $151 billion trade deficit in goods every year. Germany has tariffs on autos 4 times higher than our tariffs on equivalent German imports here, and they sell us 3 times as many cars as we sell them. So on the issue alone, we have allies strategically, but when it comes to these trade disputes, these allies basically are robbing us blind. The president is not going to put up with that. And in terms of this retaliation, I want to get back to the Canadian miscalculation here. The Canadians, because this speaks to your retaliation.
I don't mean to interrupt, but I do want to move on because we've got limited time, and I've got some other questions. Because the president also shocked the allies just before he came to Canada by suggesting, pushing the idea that Russia should be invited back into the G7 to make it the G8, the meeting, the group of economic world leaders. Here's the president on that.
It may not be politically correct, but we have a world to run. And in the G7, which used to be the G8, they threw Russia out. They should let Russia come back in.
But Mr. Navarro, Russia was kicked out of the G8 after it invaded Ukraine and seized Crimea. Why does the president think they should in effect be rewarded when they haven't done anything to clean up their action? They're still in Crimea, by welcoming them back into the G8.
Chris, let me say a couple of things here. First of all, that one's above my pay grade. Ambassador Bolton, Mike Pompeo, the president himself deal with issues like that. But just observationally, I mean, look what's happening now in Singapore. The president is willing to talk to Kim Jong-un in the hope that we can deal with denuclearization on the Korean Peninsula. He's willing to talk with any world leader, and I think the philosophy here is that when we have discussions with world leaders, we should get everybody together so that we can basically hammer some of these problems out. So I think that the bigger problem here, from my point of view, I'm the trade guy, is that we have a bunch of countries out there, whether it's strategic competitors like China or allies like Europe and Canada, basically using us as a piggy bank, using unfair trade practices. And my job at the White House is to help the president get jobs, good jobs, manufacturing jobs for the working men and women of America. And we can't do that unless we upset this existing world order, which basically is tremendously biased. We lose $500 billion a year of our wealth every single year because of these unfair trade practices. And that's what the president's standing up for.
Mr. Navarro, let's go back to a trade issue then. You are a notorious hardliner on China and the unfair trade practices there. Well, you wrote a book a few years ago called Death by China. So here's my question.
My code name at the CIA is Notorious, by the way. Go ahead.
Okay, that's interesting.
No, it's a joke, Chris.
How do you explain the decision by President Trump to lift the sanctions against the Chinese telecom company ZTE after it had violated our sanctions, our ban on doing business with North Korea and Iran, and was considered to be a serious national security risk? Why on earth would we do that?
I think you should have Secretary of Commerce Wilbur Ross on to explain the details of what is a very hard negotiation that was done. But I can tell you this, it's going to be 3 strikes you're out on ZTE. If they do one more additional thing, they will be shut down. We have a bad actor in ZTE. The president did this as a personal favor to the president of China as a way of showing some goodwill for bigger efforts such as the one here in Singapore. But it will be 3 strikes you're out for ZTE, and everybody understands that within this administration. So they're on notice. We're going to have monitors inside that company. They're changing their board of directors. They're changing their management, and they're paying us $1.5 billion in order to continue in business.
I want you to give me a 1-sentence answer on my final question.
Okay, I'll try.
Did the ZTE decision give you some heartburn?
I don't get heartburn. Justin Trudeau tried to give me heartburn. I didn't get heartburn. I'll have to think of another physical.
I'll have to think of another physical diagnosis. Mr. Navarro, thank you. Thank you for joining us today. Always good to talk with you, sir.
My pleasure. Good luck in Singapore, Chris.
Thank you.
Well, as John mentioned earlier in the show, President Trump arrived here in Singapore after leaving the G7 economic summit in Canada. And to say that he shook things up there would be, well, an understatement. Not long after the president departed, his top trade advisor accused Canada of stabbing the U.S. in the back. Here's correspondent Ellison Barber.
On July 1st, Canada says it will impose roughly $12.8 billion worth of retaliatory tariffs on the U.S. Taxes on goods in two lists, variations of products made from steel, iron, aluminum, items many Americans have at home, yogurt, chocolate, maple syrup, coffee, whiskeys, playing cards, toilet paper, ballpoint pens.
I don't want to hurt American workers. They're our neighbors, they're our friends, but my job is to stand up for Canadian workers.
Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau says he does not want to impose the tariffs, but claims he has no choice.
But the administration's choice to impose illegal and unacceptable tariffs, illegitimate and unacceptable tariffs to Canadian steel workers and auto workers and on the Canadian economy must be met with an equivalent response.
That news conference enraged the president and his administration. They say Canada has wronged the U.S. on trade for years, that the U.S.'s steel and aluminum tariffs on Canada, Mexico, and the European Union are a national security necessity. President Trump says the U.S. is now looking at adding more tariffs, this time on automobile imports.
There's a special place in hell for any foreign leader that engages in bad faith diplomacy with President Donald J. Trump and then tries to stab him in the back on the way out the door. Now, and I'll tell you this, to my friends in Canada, that was one of the worst political miscalculations of a Canadian leader in modern Canadian history.
One Republican congressman says the president isn't wrong when it comes to some of his complaints on trade, but he's concerned about a trade war.
In my district, I hear from farmers, I hear from heavy equipment manufacturers. All of them have concerns about tariffs, specifically with Canada. He needs to be strong in getting a better deal, but making sure, too, that we don't get into a full-fledged trade war. Tariffs could possibly lead us there.
There are also questions about what this could mean for NAFTA talks. U.S. Secretary of Commerce Wilbur Ross previously said the talks were separate from tariffs, but on Saturday, Canada's finance minister reportedly said they cannot work on NAFTA negotiations under the, quote, threat of tariffs.
Thank you, God bless you, and God bless America.